Good morning and welcome to today's WWF press conference. We hope you had a good break over the weekend. It's going to be another busy week here in Baku. Today's press conference will be looking over the dramatic events of last week and looking forward to what needs to happen this week to secure a strong outcome at COP29. On our panel today, we have Mark Lutz, who's kindly stepping in for Fernanda. Mark is a senior advisor for global climate policy at WWF. We also have Marianne Lotz, who'll be speaking in detail about the NCQG. She's a policy advisor at WWF Germany. We have Shirley Matheson, who's WWF's global NDC enhancement lead. And we have Maheen Khan, who's WWF's Netherlands International Climate Resilience Advisor. I'll hand over first to Mark to give us a high-level overview of what the events of last week were.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, everyone. For those of you who are just arriving this week, we hope to give you a bit of a catch-up and also tell you why this week is a hugely consequential week for the evolution and implementation of the Paris Agreement and meeting our climate goals. As you know, this is it's been called the finance COP, and there's a good reason for that. We just went through, we're almost completing, we're 1 year away from completing the first complete ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement with the global stock taking stock of global efforts, looking backward and looking forward to what's needed to keep to prevent a climate disaster and keep us on track to limiting warming to 1.5. We had what most consider a successful global stocktake. Countries are already preparing their NDCs. Some have already announced them. Some are in the early or more advanced stages. But the one final piece to put in place so countries can achieve can put forward the most ambitious climate goals possible is finance. We have the goal of 100 billion from 2020 to 2025, but we don't yet have a goal for the post-2025 period. That's what this COP, that's the main thing this COP has to produce. As we know, it's getting harder and harder to get on track to 1.5. The latest assessment of the Climate Action Tracker is now we're on track to 2.7 degrees with the risk of much greater warming, depending on where we're at in the probabilities. And with every year that passes, it gets harder and harder to limit warming to 1.5. The atmospheric concentrations are rising. And it's not just getting harder, it's getting more expensive. The price tag is rising to meet our climate goals every year, and not just on mitigation, not just on limiting warming to 1.5, but also the impacts are rising, so adaptation is going to be much higher, and perhaps the highest price tag of all, if we don't get on track, is loss and damage. We're already into the many hundreds of billions, and that will rise exponentially as temperature rises. Some of you may not have been here last week. Just to give a sense of the dynamic, last week was a very tough week. We lost largely because of the lack of certainty about the finance outcome. There was very hard slogging in a lot of tracks, little progress, and indeed some setbacks on things that are very important to us, like the mitigation work program. You'll also hear about adaptation and where we're at on that. But the mitigation work program went to Rule 16, which means they couldn't reach agreement, and it'll be kicked to next year unless the presidency decides to do something about it. It may seem we're in a very difficult place here at the middle of the COP, given the lack of progress last week, but in a sense, it's a little bit predictable with very difficult, highly political issues like finance. The negotiators they do everything they can to stick to their negotiating mandates when it's at the negotiator level, at the more technical level in the first week, to set things up for their ministers to have the best conditions to meet their goals. But it's the ministers who always resolve these difficult issues, and as the week goes on, you'll see the text, I'm sure, the number of options reducing, narrowing down to getting a clearer idea of the outcome. And it's the ministers who can go to their red lines, and in some cases, I'm sure in this case, some will have to go beyond their red lines to get some agreement. I'm sure there's consultations going on at the highest level of governments right now between ministers and finance ministers and that sort of thing. And even the leaders are gathering right now in Rio de Janeiro, and this is on their minds as well for the G20. And we expect to see some political signals. Of course, they can't make a decision. The G20 leaders can't make a decision on for all 197 parties to the Paris Agreement and the Convention, but they can send positive political signals that can help enable progress here. So, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a wild ride this week, and as they say, failure is not an option. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Marianne, can you take us some more detail on the NCQG status?
Yes, so we came to this COP with a 9-page framework document for the draft negotiation text, and we quickly saw that balloon up to 34 pages and eventually ended up at 25 pages for the draft negotiation text for the new collective codified goal on climate finance. So last week definitely felt like being transported back in time for the last 3 years of the ad hoc working program and the technical expert dialogue on the NCQG. And we see now that this text is very difficult for the ministers to work with, because on the good side, it contains all the possible text options again, but also on the bad side. From our point of view, what needs to stay in that text is those passages that reflect a needs-based quantum of about $1 trillion in public finance and highly concessional finance, with sub-goals that are roughly balanced between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And additionally, we need high-quality finance provisions that enhance access, transparency, and review of the goal. Those passages must remain as well. In the text, we also see very important wording that highlights the role of high-emitting sectors and the potential of applying the polluter pays principle. So it's really important getting those in on paying the bill on climate who are actually most responsible and able to pay it. In the text, we also see wording on phasing out fossil subsidies as soon as possible, and this is very crucial to remain. The text especially notes that the 6th biennial assessment found that fossil subsidies averaged $1.1 trillion from 2021 to 2022. So we see the funds are there and they can be rechanneled. And ultimately, this week, we must finally see a number put on the table by developed countries. We want to see them rise up to the responsibility they have, and ideally rather sooner than later. So that would finally bring us to an ambitious outcome on the NCQG here in Baku.
Thank you, Marianne. Shirley, as Mark set out, This is a really important next 12 months for NDCs. Could you tell us what we learned last week about the direction NDCs may be going in and how the negotiation tracks that will feed into that have been progressing?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Robin. Hi, everybody. So I'm following the global stocktake follow-up and all elements related to the NDCs throughout these couple of weeks. There's a question for us on how the discussions that are happening in the room this week and also in the corridors are important for NDCs. These nationally determined contributions being the national plans that countries need to produce to show how they are responding to the needs of the Paris Agreement and also to the outcome of the latest stocktake that we got last year at COP28. This is really important, I think. If you've been following this for a while, you know the importance of this process of countries doing their nationally determined ambition. Coming out of the global stocktake from last year, we really are seeing a strong feeling that the NDCs are seen as the solution to this problem that we know that has been around for a few years, that there is a very large ambition gap on the mitigation side, on the adaptation side, on the finance side. So these NDCs, which are known as NDCs 3.0, are really seen as really important to show that parties are really responding to the needs of addressing this problem. If you've been following the reports that have been coming out recently, the UNFCCC synthesis report on NDCs came out last month. It wasn't a surprise for us to see, but there really hasn't been any movement on ambition within the NDCs. It's pretty much exactly the same conclusions as last year. This is not a surprise to us because we know that parties are doing the work on the ground at the national level to develop their NDCs, and they should be providing this to us ahead of February next year or throughout the next year, and how they are responding. But there's some really important elements here that we need to see in the discussions at the higher level, including addressing the pre-2030 ambition. It's really clear that if we don't close the window now, that we will be losing the cost-effective pathways. And I think there's a lot of discussion about climate change and action to address climate change and how that is going to be very costly for people on the ground, but it's going to be more costly if we're not going to address the problem now. So that's the type of signals that we're looking for. Also some of the sectoral discussions around fossil fuels, around deforestation, around synergies across the agreements. This was all very clear in the global stocktake. But what I've always said is that the global stocktake as an outcome, really the benefit of this comes in how parties are responding to this here, this week, last week, and also within their NDCs. So what we've seen in the past week is some announcements from the Troika countries, from the United Arab Emirates and from Brazil on their new NDCs, as well as some other countries, including the UK and Switzerland. We're still pending some signals from Azerbaijan, but we are anticipating that they will come out with some ambition to really stimulate some of these conversations over the next few months. Within the room, there is some interesting dynamics that I wanted to pick up on. Following up on the GST, there is a discussion already on, this UA dialogue, which should be implementing the outcome of the global stocktake. If you've been following this throughout the year, what I will say is it's been quite disappointing to see that the conversation has not really moved on past the conversations in June. So what I've been seeing is nothing really new, to be honest. And that's something that I think there's a lot of frustration in the room. There's a lot of anxiety around the NCQG. I know we're seeing that in other work streams as well. But that's a really important point to note, that there's a need for parties to really get together and work through this. We're really hoping to see some movement in week 2. I know there's some discussions on how they can move this forward. There has been some text, but like I said, it's really sort of options. We're not really getting further on this. So the NDCs, it's really important. The NCQG outcome is really important for this, but the NCQG is bleeding into other aspects which are also important for the NDCs. So really hoping to see some elements on this. The other thing I wanted to note is it's very interesting. Conversations are already starting about the next global stocktake. And as a sort of flip side to this is we're seeing that this is progressing fairly well. So what I'm sort of seeing is that there is there's appetite to talk about things that are going to be happening in the future to have decisions, but really a struggle on the decisions that need to be happening now in terms of how we're going to talk about implementing the global stocktake. This always also bleeds into the conversations that have reemerged that we had a few years ago on NDC features, which is talking about characteristics that maybe can help us talk about consistency across NDCs without really impinging on the nationally determined nature there. So again, that's a little bit of a conversation that parties are having on, do they want to have the conversation now or later? But like I said, the pre-2030 ambition is so important that we really are urging them to really try and make progress on this today. The concern that we have is the window is closing really fast to achieve 1.5, and parties really need to be having the conversations now and not pushing this further into the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Shirley. Maheen, you've been following the negotiation tracks focusing on adaptation. We know this is also a really important year for countries to be submitting national adaptation plans as well. Could you let us know what we've been seeing over the last week and what we need to see this week for adaptation?
Thanks, Robin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of COP29, and thank you for joining us today. So to answer Robin's question, the needle did not move as much as we wanted it to since last week on the issue of adaptation. So I wanted to remind all of us that adaptation is also a climate justice issue. Countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis are paying for adaptation action from their own domestic resources, in addition to their costs, to other costs which they bear for their economic development. This has also been reported by the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. Of course, developed countries are also witnessing the debilitating impacts of climate change, as we saw in many parts of Europe and the US, but they have access to resources in terms of finance capacity and innovative technology. We stand at a crossroads this year where it is crucial to rebuild trust among parties. And indeed, we are seeing gigantic efforts from negotiators from all parties in the rooms where discussions are being held. But we need results, and we need access to resources and action urgently. For both global goal and adaptation and national adaptation plans, 2 of the agenda items ongoing, draft texts have been forwarded to this week's COP and CMA for further negotiation to reach a conclusion. The Adaptation Fund, through which donor countries are meant to provide 300 million, has only received 61 million so far, as per my last check. Nonetheless, it falls largely short of what is needed. As my colleagues have mentioned, while finance remains the main issue of contention in all adaptation rooms, we have to keep pushing for cross-cutting issues of gender transformative language, nature and ecosystem protection, because climate adaptation is about the vulnerable. Enabling environments for marginalized groups such as women and youth and protection of ecosystems and biodiversity are vital for increasing resilience and vulnerability of people, their livelihoods, food security, water security, and safety and security in general. These language need to be strengthened in the texts as we deliberate on them this week. It is key that we maintain the political elevation of climate adaptation and climate mitigation with equal weight. Going forward in COPs, a permanent agenda on GGA is being discussed and should be agreed upon as to continue discussions in the future. Parties must agree to the cadence of expert workshops along with means of implementation language under the Global Goal on Adaptation negotiations. For national adaptation plans, while private sector acknowledgement is important, as all of society approach needs to be the architecture in building resilience of society, environment, ecosystem, in UNFCCC, negotiation between parties should focus solely on international public climate finance for adaptation. There are also gaps in private sector investment in adaptation that needs to be explored. And I mention this because this is one of the contentious items being discussed in the NAP negotiation rooms. In addition to that, we also need to make sure that the national adaptation plans are absolutely being concluded at the COP this year, because they are due to be submitted, updated next year in 2025, and significant progress need to be reported on them by 2030. This is a critical decade, as we all know. So this week, we must make headway and gigantic steps to ensure that the NAPs are concluded. And under global goal on adaptation, we have clear guidance to experts to narrow down the indicators list, and also other elements such as monitoring and evaluation systems, scientific information with other knowledge systems such as indigenous and local and traditional knowledge are being discussed for plans and action under adaptation in terms of a roadmap. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maheen, and thank you all our speakers. We'll now go to the portion of the event where we'll take questions from the floor to our panel. If you could please raise your hand if you have a question. In the room, we've got one there, down the front. Sorry. Can you get that microphone to the front as well?
Hi, I'm Shabana from Singapore, the Straits Times. I had a question on adaptation to Maheen. Wanted to ask about the progress with the NAPs, especially with Southeast Asia. Are there any insights you've managed to get over the negotiations?
Sorry, I must ask you to repeat that. I couldn't hear the last part.
Sorry, I wanted to ask about the progress with the NAPs in terms of Southeast Asian countries so far.
Thank you for that question. Indeed, there are many countries around, I think last checked, 59 countries have submitted national adaptation plans, with majority of the countries from Southeast Asia. I think the latest one in the last few months was from the Philippines. There has also been national adaptation plans submitted by Indonesia, and from South Asia, Bangladesh as well. I'm sorry, I don't have the list memorized at the moment, but we do have a lot of submission of NAPs from countries in Southeast Asia. I think what is the main issue here is that these plans need to be translated into action. And therefore, that is what is crucial in the NAP negotiations, because we have to have some language on the means of implementation to enable that action in these countries. Does that answer your question? All right, thank you.
Thank you. The question's down the front. Is Adam?
I've been asked to stand up. Sorry, I'm just going to squeeze out here. Adam Vaughan from The Times. I've got a couple of questions. One for you, Shirley. Azerbaijan's NDC, there was some speculation it's coming today, but I'm hearing now that it's not. When are you expecting it? What would an ambitious one look like? And the second question for you all probably is, it feels quite bleak in terms of where we were at the end of last week, but is your sense that this week countries will actually compromise because they might see this as actually their last best chance, because we're going to have a different US regime in Belém next year, so actually, despite all the negative music, we will actually get a good deal on the finance in the end?
Yeah, Shirley, if you take that first one, and Mark, if you can speak to the second.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've heard similar things. I know that they have a press conference today, and we wondered if they were going to make an announcement. We haven't really heard kind of strong intel on that, so I can't give you anything more there. But I think that there's definitely been a concerted effort from the Troika to really think about what this idea of 1.5 looks like from the perspective of NDCs. From WWF's perspective, we understand that this is a collective goal that needs to be met by all parties, but each party needs to be pushing their ambition on the national level. I mentioned a little bit before on some of the really important areas for us, and that includes the pre-2030 ambition. I'm really keen to see parties come out revising what they're going to be doing by pre-2030. That doesn't mean necessarily updating a target per se. I think the IPCC has been very clear, the emissions gap has been very clear that there's some key technologies that need investment, and they are actually, there's a really strong business case. So I recall, I think the emissions gap report said that if we really are investing in solar and wind technologies, we could close the gap by something like 27%. So this is really significant. This is significant for a country like Azerbaijan. I think we've all seen what it's like outside of the venue. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and I would really like to see that. There's other aspects on synergies with the Global Biodiversity Framework. A lot of our delegation has also been at the CBD COP. We did see disappointingly that we didn't get as many biodiversity plans as we wanted. wanted. And this idea of looking across synergies, I think, is very important. We spent the day yesterday in the national park looking to see what was here in Azerbaijan, and I would really like to see some alignment there. So that's some of the key parts that I'd like to see in the Azerbaijani NDC.
Yeah, I'll respond to the question about whether we can expect to see some compromise towards an agreement this week. I think there's no doubt that we're facing headwinds on the global response to climate change with the election results in the U.S., what Argentina did in withdrawing from this negotiation. There's other global problems in the headlines and diverting attention and resources from climate change. But I think we've also seen signs that the vast majority of the countries in the world are committed to continuing to fight climate change. I think we will certainly see compromises this week. This is what ministers are here for, to negotiate and converge on an outcome. I'm reasonably optimistic we'll get some kind of outcome this week. I know the stakes are too high for failure, especially after what happened in Cali with the CBD and another failure to get an agreed outcome on finance would be a terrible sign for this process. And I think ministers are aware of that and willing to make the hard choices necessary by the end of the week to get an outcome. I just hope it's an ambitious outcome that can mobilize the resources in line with what's needed to address vulnerabilities and limit warming to 1.5. Thanks.
Time for a really quick final round. If we can have Victoria and James in quick succession. 2 minutes. Yes. Okay. Microphone, and then to Victoria after.
Just very quickly then, could you sketch out what that outcome might be? Because they seem miles apart at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any landing zone at all. And just also very quickly for the whole panel, how concerned are you at the risk of contagion? The US is going to leave. It looks highly likely Argentina is going to leave. Other countries could go to their electorates essentially having referenda on the Paris Agreement. How concerned are you that we are staring down the barrel of things starting to fall apart a little bit?
Okay, thanks. Can you just pass the microphone quickly backwards?
Mine's just a technical question. I can follow up afterwards to save time.
All right, James asked a very big question, so I think we'll end with that one. And Mark, if you could try and address that big question. And then there will be, our panelists will be available afterwards for further comment outside the room. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, there were two questions. One on the risk of contagion. If we start seeing other countries withdrawing, that would be a very bad sign. I don't think it's going to happen that other significant important countries will withdraw, but I could be proven wrong on that. But I'm fairly optimistic that there's a strong consensus globally to move forward with action on this. In terms of what the convergence will look like on the NCQG, Marianne may want to add something, but of course there has to be some kind of top-line number coming out of this. I hope it's in the ballpark of $1 trillion. A lot will depend on the quality of that number. How much is public finance? How much is private? How much is loans? That sort of thing. If there's some parameters around that. And of course, the question of how they deal with the question of the contributor base, a very political question, but it seems they are advancing on that. Thanks.
Sorry. I'm afraid we're having to wrap up there. Thank you all very much for attending. We'll have our speakers available for further comment outside the room at the back. Hope you all have a great rest of your day in Baku. Thank you.